Okay. Is it that you feel unqualified to talk about this subject because you don't have a uterus?
That's part of it.
Okay.
The other part of it is that I realized as I was looking over information that I don't understand a lot about constitutional law, which is no surprise since I've never studied it. But I just didn't realize how deep a rabbit hole even a cursory overview might take you.
I think, I know you wanted to have a disclaimer on this, but I'm going to put this disclaimer out here ahead of you and say, if you're at all triggered by white dudes talking about women's issues, this might not be a good episode to listen to. But, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I would also encourage maybe listening and providing some feedback to help us understand better how to talk about it, right?
You know, I have met some women, they're like, you don't even need to talk about it. And I was like, I need to talk to other white dudes about this. Like, my audience for this subject is not women. My audience for this subject is other people that look like me, that identify with the same labels that I identify with.
Right. The only way those of us who find issue with different events can lend any type of support to changing those things is to understand it in a way to try to craft a narrative that explains it to others like us who don't grasp it.
Yes. With that being said.
And so it's, I wouldn't even call it activism. I would call it education, except that we've already kind of ranted on how horrible education is to use as a catch-all for things.
Yes. So is it unethical or immoral that we said that?
Technically neither.
No, I know. It's just it's going to be my long running joke. Is like, is it so.
Yeah, no, I get it. So the topic at hand, of course, is the seemingly all-out attack on a women's right to choose. So reproductive rights would be the kind of catch-all phrase I would use.
Seemingly?
Well, we'll get to that. I chose that intentionally because I've realized there are a number of arguments that I don't understand well enough to be able to say with complete certainty that it is an attack from all fronts versus trying to put the decision-making activities in the hands of the right group. And so we'll get back to that because I also have issue with that thought.
Okay, now is it a problem with reproductive rights, or we just don't like Republicans allowing big government to get between us and our doctors?
It's a good question.
Okay.
Because in some of the reading that I did, it also talked about how this is a fairly uniquely American issue because in most other countries where this is a non-issue, there's also universal access to healthcare.
Yeah. So do we want to do a brief history as to how we got here? Because, Roe versus Wade wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, we can. Let me pull up my notes because I kind of outlined it in the notes in a very haphazard kind of way because I was trying to piece together my thought process as well. So let me kind of mention, I want to unify the past few shows a little bit too with tonight's theme. Part of what triggered me was I saw a blurb about an argument against vaccine mandates citing liberties of the individual or liberties of the people. Mm-hmm. But to me, that's the same argument that would uphold Roe versus Wade and strike down the different abortion bans. And so I was questioning why there was an attack on mandates, but there was seemingly no attack on prohibiting abortion. And that's what started the thought process for understanding or trying to understand what seemed at face value to be hypocritical.
Well, it is hypocritical.
It is.
I mean, it's been
but it is because we built in a hole that I'm not so sure existed. We'll get to kind of all the caveats and why I wanted to pose the question in the first place. But let's start with the history of how abortion was protected or became a fundamental right, and then what led to us being in the state we are today. Did you have a summary you wanted to give, or do you want me to go over what I dropped in the notes?
So there was an excellent summary. There's an excellent episode of Fresh Air from circa somewhere between 2005 and 2010, and I've gone back and listened to this episode numerous times, and I'll get the link for you to put in the notes. But Terry Gross interviewed the author of God in the White House, and it just talked about how evangelicals began to politicize issues in the early 1980s, and it all centered around a case, and this should be no surprise to anybody, that had to do with money. Bob Jones University was slapped with an IRS bill, even though they had a non-exempt status. The IRS requested taxes from them because they deemed that they did not qualify for tax-exempt status because they were what is the nice way of saying? They're just a racist institution.
I mean, you could say that they had views that they chose to discriminate against specific individuals.
Discriminate was the word. So they didn't allow black students to enroll in their university until 1990. And they didn't allow unmarried black students to roll into the university until 1994. So like after apartheid. Anyway, they during the Carter administration, the IRS hit them with a tax bill, and they had to pay. And there was no conservative right, but this is when the conservative right formed, and they were feeling vulnerable because of the power that the government had over them by deeming them non-tax exempt because of their discriminatory enrollment practices. And on a conference call, they were working on coming up with issues to sort of like galvanize the entire movement. And somebody suggested abortion, which is very odd because prior to this would have been for the first Reagan election campaign, and prior to that, Ronald Reagan had written the most liberal abortion bill into law as governor of California. The Southern Baptist Church wrote letters affirming the Roe versus Wade decision. So there's all of basically like in the on what we would look at as the right. One of the only organizations that did not support Roe versus Wade was the Catholic Church. They've been sort of consistent with their position on medical abortion, and so all of this is rooted in money.
Yeah, not a history lesson to come across, but I didn't actually trace that line of thought either. So it's interesting to hear. Like what the line of thought that I started with was why the ruling on the mandates was considered unconstitutional and how that related to Roe. And so it's interesting to hear that side of things.
Yeah. it was so fascinating to me when I heard about it, and I was like, that makes so much sense. There's a lot of support saying that shows there was this 180 turn, this 180 in 1980 on the position from so many different organizations and it all had to do with money and not actually reproductive rights or saving the lives of the unborn. Which, yeah. So anyway, so that we cite our sources, I will definitely provide you with a link to that. It's a great episode. There's a lot more to that episode about religion and politics, and it's definitely a recommended listen.
So it also might help to illustrate why the ruling in Roe
totally
seems to draw conclusions from extremely vague sources. So when I was going back and looking at some of the information on Roe, one of the things that was emphasized, again, I have a handful of links that I'll drop in the show notes to follow, but one of the things that was mentioned was that key to the ruling was drawing from the First, Fourth, Ninth, and 14th Amendments, where the court said that the Constitution protects an individual's zones of privacy. And it cited other cases that ruled that contraception, marriage, and child rearing were activities included in those zones. And so the court basically said that it was broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate pregnancy as a part of that right to privacy. But in the judgment, they also emphasized that it was not a unilateral right that could not be further modified in the future. And I tried to figure out exactly how, and this is where I just didn't have time to do further research. I tried to figure out exactly how this idea of a right to privacy was interpreted, because one of the references spoke to the 14th Amendment specifically, which in its entirety only states that all citizens of the U.S. shall not be deprived of any of the privileges afforded them, which are life, liberty, or property, without due process of law. And nothing about that indicates any level of privacy to me. And again, this is going back to the initial disclaimer. I'm in no way, shape, fashion, or form qualified to interpret the Constitution and apply, legal precedent to it. But I couldn't find anything that specifically indicated to me from a just fundamental meaning or understanding of what I understand to create this idea of a fundamental right to privacy in the way it's being used to encapsulate things on a number of different fronts. I mentioned the vaccines being part of what sparked the line of questioning, but my just pure level of appellation, I guess. I'm purely appalled by an attack on a woman's right to choose. But I also, as I was digging in, started noticing that I didn't see the same thing that was interpreted and judged as a constitutional right. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And it left me with more questions than answers, because I started to compare the base statements from the court to some of the statements from the courts on the mandates, and found some interesting things that made me question if Roe was actually an overstepping of the court's jurisdiction and interpretation, or if I'm just missing something entirely.
I see that, because I've wondered that too, based on some of the things that the justices have written about, and it made me sort of wonder about that. I've had similar wonderings, and I feel like.
Can I interject real quick to just say that
please.
I'm fully in support of the decision with Roe. I'm just trying to understand the legal arguments because that's where the change has to happen, obviously. I just wanted to emphasize that the decision itself I don't have any issue with at all. It's just now I'm questioning, was it the right way to have that decision, or should it have been via congressional action instead?
Well, I'm really glad you say that, because I feel like the framers of our Constitution would kind of look at us and tell us how foolish we are for, like, the Constitution is a good document, but this sort of sacrosanct approach that we've had, I think would be something that they find off-putting, because they wrote it in such a way that you can adjust it and make changes to it, not necessarily easily, so we can't make these changes on a whim, but we make changes to this to better society, because they knew that they wouldn't be able to forever know what the issues of the day would not be applicable even like a decade down the road, much less, almost 2.5 centuries. So
yeah. One of the things that really kind of helped illustrate that idea goes back to the vaccine mandates. I didn't realize that the only mandates that have been halted by the courts have been those issued via agencies like OSHA or I don't remember what CMS stands for now. It's related to the Medicare services, Medicaid. Any challenges to mandates brought by individuals against companies or states have been ignored or ruled constitutional by the courts. It's only been the mandates at the federal level, with the statement being added that it should not be something enacted by agency, but is in the purview of the legislature. And that framework or that phrasing is what made sense to me. Because if the court is truly impartial, the idea isn't that it is attacking the mandate at all, or that it's attacking the fact that it's the best course for public health policy. It's merely stating this isn't the way to do it.
Right.
And so if you extrapolate that a little bit to Roe, it seems like, unfortunately, just given the nature of a number of states, but it seems like the idea is the same, that the issue that the court seems to have with the rulings is not the ruling itself necessarily, though that may be the case. It's that it was done by the court to affect rights instead of being done by Congress.
Right. What we're looking for is an amendment to the Constitution that allows people to have rights for certain body autonomy and access to health care.
Or maybe even broader, just something that specifically outlines what rights cannot be restricted by a specific group.
So here's a problem I have with it. Why this right? Why is this right restricted? Why is not the right to a particular I want a particular cosmetic surgery, or I want a particular round of a particular course of drugs for this ailment? Why are those not being restricted? Why is this specific form of healthcare being restricted? So, because every bit of pro-life propaganda isn't based in fact or science.
So in the in the history of Roe, reading about the background of the just general social climate, social and political climate, it makes sense why the Roe verdict was handed down the way it was, because it was a public health crisis from the standpoint of enough women pursuing illegal abortions because of lack of access to
safe legal ones. Yeah,
correct.
Like the black
that
market
it became
back
an
alley.
epidemic.
Yeah,
and so from that standpoint, it makes sense that at the time Roe was an important way to protect the health of a large number of people. What's disheartening is that it went to the courts and nothing was done from a legislative standpoint to cement it as an unassailable right.
Right. There's been a number of times where those that promote the pro-choice platform had enough power to codify Roe versus Wade, and it's never been done. They've left it out there as something that can be attacked.
Which does bring us to the current situation where the court seems to be leaning toward, if not completely refuting or overturning Roe, at least modifying it by some significant degree. We don't know, of course, what the outcome will be at this point, but I think it's clear to allow the different, specifically the Texas ban, to stand and not order a stay indicates with perfect clarity that Roe as we know it will not continue to exist. The only question is whether it will be completely overturned or severely modified.
Right.
That being the case, this is where the course of action has to be via legislature. And the only way I see a positive path forward is through national legislation, not leaving it up to the states, because the states have already indicated a complete lack of concern for, honestly, a woman to have any control over her body.
Yeah, at least some of them do. There are fewer, but there's some that are giving more rights to women. But yeah, there are too many states with too many women in those states that are being stripped of their rights to body autonomy and access to safe medical health care. I get angry about it.
Yeah, that's the whole reason I paused, because I know, like, at this point I've kind of provided the background and I've provided the thoughts. It's just, at one point, do you just call out how fucked up it is for how fucked up it is?
Well,
you know,
yeah. So here's the thing. This is what the hypocrisy of it all. I know people think that they are. I know there are a lot of people that think that they are doing the right thing and they think that they have a good cause in their mind, but that's because they've never thought about it. They've never actually looked to see what is actually happening. You know, like the whole thing is like life starts at conception, and it doesn't. That's just untrue. Life started before conception. The cells that come together that defines conception were alive before conception. So life does not start there. And then, you hear people talk about the heartbeat. It's like, well, there's a heartbeat at this, very few weeks along. And I was like, yeah, so what? When a person dies and their hearts, or when a person's heart stops, they're not pronounced dead. They try to restart their heart because they're not dead. So the presence of a heartbeat does not indicate life. There are plenty of people that are on life support that are removed from life support. Their heart beats. It does not indicate life. It's the heart beating. But what really drives me crazy is I have never heard a goddamn pro-life person ever talk about banning in vitro fertilization. There are so many pro-life positions that say conception is the beginning of life, and that is a brand new person, and they must be protected. But not a single one of them have ever said anything about in vitro fertilization, where so many eggs are fertilized with spermatozoa and get tossed. They're either frozen or tossed when they're done. Not a single one has ever said we must stop IVF. Where the fuck are you when it comes to IVF? Because if you look at the numbers and you believe that that's a new person, that fertilized egg is a new person, IVF is, quote unquote, murders twice as many unborn babies as medical abortions.
Well, the whole point is
drives
that
me crazy.
The pro-life arguments are there for other reasons. It's why they can't point to something that makes scientific sense.
They're pulling on, yeah.
With the one exception of viability. If you point to survivability of an embryo outside the womb, being able to actually deliver and have the child survive, at that stage, I can get on board with a medical or scientific reasoning and explanation for at that stage we want to talk about it.
I used to think that way. And then I heard Pete Buttigieg talk about his position on this, and I really appreciated it. But he said, you know what? We're going to draw a line in the sand, and the line that we draw is birth. Whether it is an induced birth or a naturally occurring labor, that's where I draw the line. And everything prior to birth, the mother of that child should be able to choose what happens. The mother of that the mother of her unborn child needs to be able to choose that, even if it's the 8th or the 9th month. Which that sounds really awful, but we're talking about less than 1% of abortions. It's a very small number of abortions that occur that in the 3rd trimester. And at that point in time, she's probably already got a name picked out for her unborn baby. She's probably already got a nursery set up. All these things have been done and planned. And if for some reason you get that far along in the pregnancy and you feel like you need to terminate it, we should trust the mom to be able to do that and make that decision, because something is up, and I'm gonna trust people to be able to make the right decision for their lives, and that's where we draw the line. And I just really appreciated that position, because I feel like it's a valid argument for a very small number of cases.
Yeah, it's not something I would even begin to weigh in on. For me, there's no decision there. I'm not in a position or possess the requisite reproductive organs to make any type of judgment call. Right.
And that's why we leave it to the women.
Which is what I was going by, though, or what I was getting at wasn't that that's where we need to draw the line. It's where I would accept logical discourse. Like, it's fine if you feel like this is where we need to discuss things and figure out whether there's a different line to draw. But any of the arguments talking about conception up to the point of viability are horrifically flawed in the first place. That was what I was illustrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I get it. I have strong feelings about this one.
Oh no, by all means. I mean, it's one of those things that I had much stronger opinions prior to my attempting to interpret the legal side of it, not the actual humanity side of things. I'm wanting to make sure I emphasize that I'm not at all trying to debate that piece. The only thing that I really am trying to understand is why the apparent hypocrisy between vaccine mandates being, the freedom of choice and liberty and privacy versus abortion not, and trying to understand where that just complete dissonance came from.
Yeah, I know at the end of last week I sent you a quote from Justice Clarence Thomas, and I was just like, that's a point that like makes sense to me. And if we were talking about any issue, it's a point that would still make sense to me. I don't like how he's taking this point and where he's applying it, because I don't our government doesn't work and says, hey, it doesn't work in such a way where you say, hey, you guys, this Roe versus Wade thing, you guys, like, this was not the right process. You didn't put the cover letter on your TPS report, and we're going to need that cover letter. And then go through the process of correcting it and making sure that we pass a law, or like Congress passes a law, or the president writes an executive order and go through the correct procedure for this. No, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, you guys got it wrong, so now it's open season on women's reproduction rights, and that's just not okay. Like, it's problematic. And is it where if the court says, hey, we see a problem here, why don't our Congress should be like, you know what, you're right, we do see a problem here, let's work on that, let's either codify the decision, write a new law, write a new amendment. I don't know. It's just,
well, this illustrates
it's dysfunction,
right? It illustrates the primary problem, which is that we don't currently have a truly functional government.
Yes,
because if we did, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
Yes.
So the quote, just for sake of including it in the show, the quote was Justice Thomas saying, "If I were to ask you what constitutional right protects the right to abortion, is it privacy? Is it autonomy? What would it be?" That goes back and aligns well with the different things that I'd been reading, where I started to realize where the disconnect was. And I wasn't as furious as I was initially. I'm furious that it's happening.
Yes.
I'm not as furious about the court being open to modifying things or readdressing things, understanding that rationale. But at the same time, I'm furious that there's going to be a period where, for however long, women are not going to safely be able to exercise a right of choice.
Right.
And unfortunately, I see no way around that, at least not until we get past probably the next couple of election cycles, until people wake up and start to get proper representation. And that's if we emerge through the potential hellhole of 2024. Like there's a lot.
There's so much
to unpack from that. But in all reality, the likelihood of us seeing a functioning legislative branch in the next decade is slim to none.
Sadly, I think you're right. And, we talked about this on the last show, and you're like, I don't have a counter argument to this because it seems accurate to me, but this is the dark before, maybe hopefully this is the darkest hours right before the dawn, and
the night is darkest before the dawn.
Thank you. That was so much better. I butchered that. Yeah. But it's for all intents and purposes, we now live. This is the safest America that we've ever had for everyone. It's still bad for many. It's still bad for minorities, like unacceptable for minorities. But we are still in the safest America. I think it feels less good because we've gone from the 24-hour news cycle to piping it in on all the screens, and we have way more screens than we've ever had before. So it feels worse, but it's not worse. In the past 25 years, crime has dropped 50%. It's bonkers how much better it has gotten. It just feels worse, and that's good, because when it feels worse, maybe we'll fight harder. We've gotten this far. It's time to fight even harder. Don't let up on the gas.
Well, there's another part there too, where there's a strong generational pull away from just accepting what has been presented or has been thought of as the good old days. You have a number of generations saying, you know what, you're wrong. And that's overly broad, because it certainly is not ubiquitous across generational divides either. But I think we're at a point where you have a much greater number of the different brackets of age groups saying, you know what, something's not right. We can't all necessarily agree on what's not right, which is a problem. But that's a problem that we're going to always have. The biggest positive is that those of us open to trying to understand different views and trying to do better are reaching a point of overtaking those who don't share those same ideas, just from a philosophical perspective. And as that percentage of the population grows enough to be able to flex its muscle, so to speak, in the political arena by way of voting, we'll start to see change. We're just not at that threshold yet, which is why it feels so bad.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I love this saying where it was like, tradition is something a boomer did twice.
I've seen that.
And I think we talked about it on a previous show or maybe an after show where I mentioned that I was reading about Edward Norton and Brad Pitt discussing how much they hated the new VW Beetle in the late 90s when they were in production for Fight Club, and that's why they both smashed the VW Beetle. It's because they were like, the generation ahead of us loved that vehicle, and so they gave us their watered down recreation of it, and they're like, we don't want it, we don't care for it, we don't like it. So we're at the tail end of like a generation who thinks their experiences should be thrust upon us as good and the way to live. And we're over here like, no, we don't want it. You're wrong. It's fine for you to have those experiences and that to be your life as long as you're not hurting anyone else or infringing upon anyone else. But that's not what we want, and you need to leave us alone and let us have our thing. And they're like, no, you can't have your thing. You have to do it my way because your thing makes me uncomfortable.
And then I think the other way I might also, or the other thing I might also add in there is that we're also at an odd transition where things didn't change a lot over a fairly prolonged period of time, at least an average of a decade-ish, right? And then you reach the really fast pace of change that technology and innovation brought with regard to information. So while previously those advancements were more focused on maybe manufacturing or automation for mining or different physical activities, there was a point where suddenly everything exploded for the consumption and sharing of information, and that has just gotten faster and faster and faster. Up to that point, people were very resistant to change fairly ubiquitously. And you can see it now in that same resistance to acknowledge a different reality existing today than existed, 20, 30 years ago. Well, maybe not the best phrasing. Same realities existed, it's just now it's exposed. Now it's intertwined with other realities.
Perception is different now.
Right. But the big thing is when you hit those who had to respond to that fast-paced change, and so by that I mean traditionally Gen X and later, you have groups of people who are far more accepting of change even when it's uncomfortable because they've been exposed to change constantly. And it's not always change for the better, but it's far less resistance to the idea of something that I know from a decade ago being different now is not an alien concept.
There's just a higher level of adaptability. But let's be honest here. Gen X doesn't care about change. They can change, and they just don't care.
Very true. I will support that wholeheartedly. We'll just roll with it.
You say that, but you're honestly not apathetic enough to, as Gen X tend to be.
That's because I'm in that in between.
I know. We've talked about this. I remember once saying something, and somebody's like, "That sounded very Gen X of you. How old are you?" And I'm like, "I was born in '81," and they were like, "Oh, okay, interesting." Anyway, I was just thinking about, as you were saying this, it used to be that before our lifetimes, you could read something in a book that might have been printed years ago, and it was still generally accepted knowledge. And today, that thing we heard this morning may be irrelevant or has changed so drastically that we're like, disregard that. It's a new thing now. There's this going on now, or it has changed this much today. Like you can't say that it's this because these events have happened today, and now we're talking about it like this. So it's just a rapid change, which is why we don't have encyclopedias and volumes anymore that are it's not relevant anymore. So if you grew up in a world where books is where you got, a strong source of, is like books were your only source of knowledge, and maybe the daily paper, because at that point the fastest changing information was daily, and that was like with newspapers and news broadcasts. That was the fastest information change for folks. For us, something a day old is stale and old. We're used to it being, the news from yesterday being old news. It's not irrelevant, but it's not up to date.
Yeah, it's still.
I think I said that right.
Yeah, you did. It's still necessary, typically, to understand contextually how you got to the news of the day.
We build on that.
Right. It's a lot like the way we've talked about with the COVID response, seeing the scientific method in action.
Yes.
It's generally accepted for those of us who understand how much change can occur from one observation to the next, or from one advancement to the next, or understanding to the next. But it's obviously frightening for those who never really were exposed to it on a regular basis, which seems like a pretty large digression from the topic at hand, except that, and this is I guess kind of the way to tie it all together, I mentioned that I was furious when I first put together the notes, and so I started doing a little bit of reading and understanding some of the things that were published from one point in the day to just a few hours later, and being able to tie some of that into historical context and understanding the background of the day made all the difference in the world for me trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing play out and being able to separate that from my complete and utter despair for the course of action that was going to occur, and being able to separate those. Like that's the fundamental thing that previous generations seem incapable of. Like I can be completely appalled by the actions being taken, but I can also detach myself from that to try to understand the viewpoints that I am reading to figure out how to proceed from this point to a better next point. Why is it those people we've elected to represent us can't?
Because they don't represent us.
That's part of it, for sure.
They represent the lobbies that pay them.
I have no argument for that. The other way I was going to tie it in is just that they're also, boomers and older and are incapable of understanding the same thought processes. But that also is a fairly weak argument. I mean, the money is the stronger argument by a long shot.
Yeah, best lesson I ever learned in Sunday school was if you want to understand the adult world, follow the money trail. We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after-show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.